Welcome to the MVFC First Goal podcast. I'm your host, Kelly Burke, and joining me today to talk about the state of college football, COVID, will we play, and so much more is the longtime commissioner of the Missouri Valley Football Conference, Patty Viverito. Patty, how are you?
I'm doing well. All things considered, I'm doing great.
Good. How have you spent the pandemic so far?
Well, I'm in my sunroom, which was a recent addition to our house, and so I camp out here in this lovely sunny place, and the other half of the room is my yoga studio. So that's the other thing that I do to keep sane. But people just assume since it's summer and there's no sports going on that, I just must put my feet up and, I don't know, sip cocktails. It's crazy busy because we keep spinning our wheels trying to guess what's going to happen next.
Yeah. Speaking of what might happen next, you are the vice chair of the Football Oversight Committee. And for people that are unfamiliar what that means and what you do, how would you describe your responsibilities?
Well, I've been on the NCAA Council. This is my second year of a 4-year term. And the way the NCAA Council is set up, it's representative. So every conference has representatives, but then each of the subdivisions have a commissioner representative. And so my FCS colleagues gave me the nod 2 years ago and said, go ahead, Patty, represent us. And so as part of that assignment, I also am assigned to one of the standing committees that reports to the council. And the Football Oversight Committee is where I was assigned by choice. And it started out as being great, interesting work, things like four-game transfer rules or four-game redshirt rules and the transfer environment and pretty typical NCAA agenda sort of things. And then COVID hit, and we've just sort of scrapped all the routine business, and we meet for 90 minutes every week. As vice chair, I'm part of prep calls for all of those meetings, as well as any business that needs to be transacted in between meetings. So I'm probably on, 2 or 3 calls a week for FOC, and then council meetings. We're meeting at least monthly. We had a meeting yesterday, and then the commissioners are meeting, 2, 3, sometimes 4 times a week. And so
Yeah.
a lot of Zoom calls. And it's pretty remarkable when you think how infrequently we used to meet and how frequently we meet now. And it's one of the silver linings I see in what's going on right now, because we're so much more connected and I think so much more effective because the communication is so much stronger.
We know that college football is going to look a lot different. Given the recent uptick in cases in a lot of states out there, how optimistic are you that we will still play college football come September?
Of course, everything that I say is qualified, because you can say something today and look like an idiot tomorrow for what you said. Because, the words that I'm getting really tired of using in my vocabulary are unprecedented, challenging, fluid, expensive. But that's part of our world now. Let me back up and say that the very first meeting that the Football Oversight Committee had after COVID-19 was apparently going to be a challenge for us, not just in the short term, but absolutely through the fall, and who knows how much beyond that. Everything that we have done since that very first meeting was to try to ensure that we could play football safely this fall. We are 100% committed to that goal. And I'm not ready to back off of that goal. But you would have to have your head in the sand for the last several days to not be more anxious about that possibility today than we were even a week ago. And so, yes, there have been things that have happened in college sports, in pro sports, in COVID writ large across the country that give me pause. If I had to handicap it right now, And I always tell people, I'm not a medical authority, I'm not a doctor, and I didn't even stay at a Holiday Inn last night. So take it for what it's worth. I think we're going to start the season. I think interruptions are inevitable, and I hope to God we finish the season.
I like your optimism. I always like optimism when it comes to this. And I also should quantify my question too with it is important to acknowledge there is a lot more testing out there. So obviously, some of those influx of cases, some of it is attributed to more tests being available. And then obviously some of it is attributed to other factors such as not social distancing and other things going on. When it comes to testing, what will the testing have to look like week to week to safely be able to play every Saturday?
If this goes back to the unprecedented, fluid, complex, costly. If you'd asked me that question 24 hours ago, I would have answered it differently than I'm going to answer it right now.
Interesting.
That's because of two conversations that I was part of yesterday. If you'd have asked me yesterday morning, I would have said that the NCAA is not going to set national standards, that it's going to be left to conferences, institutions, under the auspices of what our state, local, federal, NCAA guidelines are going to be, but that we weren't going to get directives. We weren't going to have standards that would be national. And then I had a meeting with Midwest commissioners where it was signaled that the FBS conferences, or at least let me qualify that, the Autonomy 5 conferences are probably a week or two away from establishing a standard for interconference play. So they understand that they may set their own conference rules, but for non-conference, there needs to be expectations and standards. And while they haven't been published yet, again, I think the signaling is that it's probably going to be once a week for football. I think it's absolutely fair to assume that any of our FCS teams that have FBS opponents on their schedule will be expected to meet that standard. So, 9 o'clock yesterday morning, that's where I thought we were. Then we had a 2-hour session with Mark Emmert and the commissioners. And Mark Emmert signaled something very different. Up until now, Dr. Hayline, Brian Hayline, who's the Chief Medical Officer of the NCAA, has been very reticent to talk about even guidelines or best practices nationally, because he fully understands that once an expectation for health and safety is set, even if it's not regulated, just being out there is going to put a lot of pressure, not just on Division I football and all the other sports, but Division II, Division III. And if we had to take the testing conditions as we know them today, in terms of availability, reliability, and cost, it's estimated that for the season, it would cost anywhere from $300,000 to $400,000 for a football team.
Wow.
It would cost somewhere in the neighborhood, if we tested before every contest, for basketball, $120,000 per team.
Oh.
Yeah. Remember that adjective I used about expensive?
Yeah.
Case in point. There are a lot of people that aren't going to play football if that's the national standard or expectation and things don't change in the testing world. What we heard from Mark Emmert yesterday was that he's come to believe that there has to be a national standard. Not that it's going to be one that's mandated by the NCAA, but one that is going to set expectations. And it's almost an academic conversation, because the NCAA is going to set standards for their championships. And I think it's pretty clear that they aren't going to do anything that's less than what FBS football is going to come out and say in a week or two. So I think the likelihood of having a standard that's anything less than weekly testing is slim. And I think that we are going to have to come to terms with that. And maybe our best strategy is to hope and pray that testing changes between now and then so that we can afford not just to play football, to play all of our sports.
I look at a state like North Dakota, who has a very low amount of cases, and they haven't had an influx of cases in weeks. So there's a challenge for a state like North Dakota because their access to actual tests is low because they don't have a lot of cases. So what challenges does that present for a UND, for a North Dakota state, to if they're required to test, even have access to those tests?
I will be embarrassed to tell you that you clearly have a better handle on what's happening in North Dakota than I did 48 hours ago. I wasn't tracking on that piece, the availability piece. I was working under the assumption that all of our schools could do testing should we move in that direction. We had a Missouri Valley Football Conference AD's call 2 days ago. Again, fluid, changes every day. Getting off that call Wednesday afternoon, I got the sense that our league would have had a pretty high comfort level with screening, testing symptomatic, understanding that we're all going to be dealing with protocols locally with contact tracing that's going to be very strict, and mandatory testing on a weekly schedule or any schedule. I didn't think we'd get into that space. And part of the reason we got there on that conversation is that, North Dakota, our newest member, said, I'm not going to be able to test at any price from what I'm looking at right now. Like, we're trying to buy the testing machine and we think we can get it by the start of football season, but we're not sure we can get the chemical agents to run the test before October.
Wow.
And you need to understand that these ingredients, these machines are a precious commodity, and people that are able to distribute those resources aren't all that inclined to send them to North Dakota for all the reasons that you just stated. And I raised that point with Dr. Emmert when we talked, or Mark Emmert when we talked yesterday, and in conversations with Dr. Hayline, because if we're going to have standards about frequency, I think we need to be very careful about standards for type of testing, because it simply might not be physically possible to do that in every market across the states.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point. It's my understanding that some conferences have formed medical advisory groups. Is that something that has been formed yet in the Missouri Valley Football Conference?
We have a COVID-19 working group. It's populated by athletic trainers and administrators across all 10 schools. We don't include doctors at this point in time because so much of what is going to happen is going to be dictated by the local medical authorities. And I'll give you another example. We have one school where they're actually able, through their local hospitals, to have access to free testing.
Really? Wow.
And their team doctor said, no way, waste of time, waste of money. And so that's at one end of the spectrum. Then you had medical authorities in the Pac-12 conferences, not that long ago, like 2 weeks ago, were saying that they thought that the standard that they were going to apply would be testing 3 times a week, because that was the only way that they felt that they could be comfortable, that they would have a true read on what the positives were in their environment. Those are the extremes we're dealing with. So to put one or two doctors on a committee,
it's like political parties at that point.
yeah, it's like, I'm not sure, like, I think I'm going to take my lead from Dr. Fauci and from Dr. Brian Hayline, because they're the ones that are representing national and NCAA. And Dr. Hayline has an advisory panel on COVID-19. I'm much more inclined to listen to them than any single team doctor in our league.
Yeah. You mentioned Dr. Hayline, that he's the NCAA Chief Medical Officer, and he addressed all the Division I commissioners the other day. What were some of the biggest takeaways with what he shared with you?
Well, so much of what he shared has changed in the last 48 hours. He told us there weren't going to be national, mandates or even guidelines or standards, and I think that's changing. I think that he, for the first time in my last 3 months of dealing with Brian, he expressed angst about the fall. And that was really unsettling for me, because he's been very optimistic that this can be done. And a little bit of background on Dr. Hayline. He's also on the board of the ITA, which runs the US Open. And so they've just come out and said that they're going to play, and they've got all these protocols. And so he's had conversations with all the national organizations, the professional sports leagues, and so he's really tapped into what's happening. And what he said is, we don't have the resources that those pro sports have, and while testing is going to be essential to part of how we manage sports this fall, we're not going to test our way out of this crisis. And so I think the direction we're getting from him is cautious optimism that masking and maybe even shields for football players may be the answer. The one thing that he was absolutely adamant about, which is just practical advice, is what we do on sidelines. He's advocating for expanding by rule the team area so that people can spread out. And he said, at no time on the sidelines or even during a practice situation can a player ever approach a coach without being masked or shielded.
Wow.
And he said, because while we are absolutely committed to the health and safety of everybody that's involved in the sport, by virtue of who they are, the most at risk are probably our coaches because of their ages. And so, while the young, healthy football player may contract COVID-19 and end up being asymptomatic or not severe symptoms, a coach may not be that fortunate. And so we need to protect everybody, and that includes the coaches. And so that's just one of hundreds, if not thousands, of decisions that we're going to need to make when it comes to every single protocol of how we do business. And that's what makes my head explode.
Yeah. To have a mask or face shield, some players obviously already play with them, but to have it on every single player's helmet, how difficult is that for the manufacturers of the helmets and to do that for every football team?
All to be determined. The shield idea is one that really has gathered steam only in the last couple weeks, and Dr. Hayline is pretty high on them. We have a number of helmet manufacturers who are looking into how we manage this. You can't just go out and buy like a lower face mask shield and attach it, because that would alter the manufacturer's helmet in a way that they'd have to go back and make sure that it tests for concussion safety purposes. And so you can't fix one problem and create another. And so there's lots of very quick work and testing that's being done on the idea of the shields. I can't imagine football players playing with masks.
I can't either.
But they would have to have a mask, just like they've got a mouth guard when they go to the sidelines, to manage that part of it, the interaction on the sidelines piece. Dr. Hayline, I said, is very optimistic about the shields being, not just for football, but for a lot of sports, being part of the solution. I can tell you that on our COVID-19 call earlier in the week, when I brought up shields, one of the football trainers said, like, without hesitation, "That's crazy." She said, if you are even in practice, like, think about the humid and heat conditions. Those shields are going to fog up. And I just said, I can't even go to the grocery store in a mask without my glasses fogging up. So, like, I get it. So there's a lot of unknown out there right now that, you know, we keep grasping for solutions. And I think that this is another presentation that came up, and it came up from the session we had with Dr. Hayline and facilities people. And the facilities people were talking about all the steps that they're taking to make facilities safe. And they talked about it in terms of no single action is going to be the solution. Think of it as a stack of Swiss cheese where there's holes in everything that you're doing. But if you stack enough slices of Swiss cheese together, chances are you'll get all the holes covered. And so we've been thinking in terms of Swiss cheese lately about how many layers can you stack to achieve safety.
That's a great analogy. What are some of the other main issues that you've discussed with university presidents in our league, athletic directors, and football coaches?
I think that we've focused, and I say we, I'm talking about the Football Oversight Committee now. We've been so focused on figuring out when we return. And, you know, we finally got that model approved, and it was passed unanimously by both FBS and FCS just a week or so ago. And it involves, you know, maintaining the regular 29-day practice that we've always had on the books. And then you back up another 2 weeks, and you have a period of 2 weeks where you can have 20 hours of what we call summer access. So it's, you know, weight training and team meetings and walkthroughs with footballs. And then we backed it up another 10 days and said you can have activities in that space for 8 hours a week. So we have a pretty long runway to figure that out. Of course, that doesn't answer your question, but it tells you kind of like where we focused until now. Now we've got to switch gears and figure out how we return to football. And again, I used the term earlier, that's when my head explodes, because when you think of all the things that need to be considered, just with a weight room and a practice and a team meeting. I was on a meeting the other day with Coach Shaw from Stanford, and he said, I was talking to one of my colleagues, this was a couple of weeks ago, and how he couldn't wait to get his team back so that he could meet with them. And he said, I looked at him and said, are you crazy? Like, we're meeting by Zoom now. And one thing we've learned is that we can do this by Zoom. He said, the thought of me bringing my team back and putting them in an enclosed room with a lot of people and our staff is like the last thing I'm going to do when our student athletes come back to campus. We're going to keep meeting by Zoom. And so, you know, again, the coaching community needs to come together and figure out how they can educate each other and our campuses on how we can manage this in a way that gives us a chance to play football this fall. Now I say that, and I think that we will have all those protocols. We will have all those best practices. We will have educated coaches and staff, and we're going to have these student athletes for 20 hours a week. And then what are they going to do with their time off? You're only as good as that one slice of cheese with the holes in it.
Yeah.
And that's what we've seen happen in the last week, with several football teams shutting down what they've just started because of outbreaks, and some caused by lack of social distancing when they're not in the on-campus facilities. They're college kids. It's not like an NBA team that you can put in a bubble and say you can't see anybody at your family for the next 3 months. That's not how it works.
Yeah.
These are college student athletes, and they can't be restricted in the same ways. All you can do is educate, hope that they will all pledge to be safe, and that the results will be positive.
It's funny that you say that, because I tweeted something earlier this week about when I started seeing, that Clemson had 28 or 30 guys test positive, and LSU and Texas, and you're used to being a college student, having the freedom to go to bars, do normal things that normal college students do. At this point, you have to be willing to sacrifice the short-term pleasures of being a college student for the long-term livelihood of being able to have a football season. And that doesn't mean that you can't see your girlfriend or your family. You just have to be really choosy about who you're associating with and how many people you're seeing outside of your team.
Yeah, this is the silver lining that I try to apply when things get really kind of scary. It's so good that we're having these experiences in June and not in August. And maybe by having these experiences now, the lesson learned will be that we don't have these same experiences in September, October, November, December.
Yeah. How do you anticipate the league broadcasts will look differently this year, especially for someone like myself who is used to being on the sideline, and I'm used to interviewing coaches or players at halftime or at postgame?
Well, the first casualty of what a game is going to look like is the beloved tradition of the pregame handshake. Kelly, I know you're well aware. We're the only football conference in the country that does a full team pregame handshake, and it's a tradition that I'm really proud of, and I think it is so symbolic in such a positive way of what this league represents. And on the call on Wednesday, and whenever we get a new coach in the league, by the way, they're going to go, "We're doing what?"
We have 3 new coaches, so.
So, I always have to, go back to square one, give them the history, tell them why we do it, and why it's a president's initiative and it's not going to change. Well, it is going to change this year. Nobody's going to be shaking hands pregame.
We'll be waving at each other.
So I conceded that we are suspending the pregame handshake. So right from the start, on an earlier podcast that you had on race and social justice issues, the question was raised about the national anthem. Should teams be out on the field for that now from a social justice perspective? So now we're not even to the kickoff yet, and we've already are looking at ways that it's going to look different. I think it's safe to say that the broadcasts are going to be more important than ever, because the likelihood of full stadiums is probably 0. The likelihood of empty stadiums is probably greater than that, although I hope we're going to fall somewhere in between those two extremes. I think we will have to make accommodations to safely broadcast the games. Will it change your job on the sidelines? Probably. Yeah.
And those are conversations. I've had that conversation with Mike, and the options that he's presented to me, they all sound great. I mean, I just want to work. So,
we want you to work, Kelly.
Yeah, you can put me in Taiwan and I would still do the broadcast, I'm willing to do whatever.
Well, think about what ESPN and our partner has already done with remote broadcasting in terms of production. There are lots of ways to do this. and to do it safely. I'm far less concerned right now about what we're going to be doing with broadcasting, partly because I'm confident that we can do it safely, and secondly because it's Mike's responsibility rather than mine, and I trust him to figure this out.
We've established that the players in some form are likely going to have to be tested regularly, but to what extent do you see coaches and trainers and support staff and officials and broadcasters, people like myself, having to get tested at all?
I think that anyone that is in risky contact with student athletes will be part of the testing protocol. Mm-hmm. So you can take it in steps. Coaches, yes. Staff, probably the equipment managers, yes. Athletic trainers, yes. When you expand that circle of contact to more peripheral areas, to be very specific, when Dr. Hayline spoke to us and we were talking about sideline, he goes, like the chain gang, do they need to be tested? He said, no, just put them in masks, and that should not be an issue. The big conundrum right now that's getting a lot of conversation is what do you do with officials? Because they're coming from outside and they're traveling every week. Now we may be able to do some geographic assignments that keeps them off planes, although I'm not even sure that's really the issue. But they're going to be staying in hotels and they're going to be traveling, and do they need to be tested weekly just like the student athletes? I don't know. That's one of those unknowns right now. Can they work in masks? Maybe. Can they work in shields? Maybe. To be determined.
You alluded to about some of the FBS teams that, some have had to shut down voluntary workouts because of outbreaks temporarily. To your knowledge, has anybody in the Missouri Valley Football Conference had to shut down voluntary workouts yet? And are you aware of any positive cases?
I'm not, but a lot of our teams aren't doing voluntary workouts yet. A lot of some of our facilities aren't even open yet. And so I think we're going to see waves of parts of the team coming back, really starting probably early July. Missouri State was the exception to that. They brought their team back for voluntary workouts, or opened it for voluntary workouts pretty early. I've not heard of positive tests. But it's not even just the positive tests. It's the risk, the high risk contacts, that if somebody tests positive, then everybody that falls into that category also has to self-quarantine or quarantine in some way. And our campuses don't make that decision. It's the local health authorities that do the contact tracing, that decide who needs to be taken out of the mix for activities. And so again, hopefully they're all paying close attention to the news and are recognizing that positive tests are inevitable. And one of the scary parts of this is that a lot of those positive tests are asymptomatic, and that's great for the student athlete that they're not sick, but it means that they could be spreading the disease very unknowingly in ways that young people can sometimes seem like they're invincible, and it's not, they're not at risk. And so it's educating everybody to recognize that we're all responsible, not just for our own safety, but for the safety of others when it comes to the health protocols.
What are some of the other conferences out there that you're paying close attention to look to as models for Valley football?
I had an email just last night from one of our SWAs who told me what her strategy was for establishing protocols on their campus. And she said one word: steal. She has, a friend on an A5 campus who sets their entire protocol, institutional protocol, and she said, I'm just changing names and locations. She said, because they've done really good work. And so, yes, we can all learn from each other. And part of these seminars that we had with the commissioners earlier this week was a plea from the FCS commissioners to our FBS colleagues to say, help us. We know that you're several steps ahead of us in terms of planning and putting resources into these plans and these protocols. And without exception, the response was a resounding, of course we'll help. Just say what you need and we will do that. And so we're actually sort of setting up a clearinghouse where we can share what the plans are at both the campus and conference levels in a way that so we're not all spinning our wheels trying to do the exact same things, 100 different times. And I think we'll learn from that. And just as a sidebar that doesn't have anything directly related to COVID-19, we had the same conversation about social justice initiatives.
Oh,
and,
nice.
Yes, and that was a very enlightening and positive. It was such a breath of fresh air after all of the angst-filled conversations we were having about COVID-19, to have a conversation about action plans for dealing with social justice issues was so refreshing. And we're equally committed to sharing ideas in that realm.
Good. And and I should mention too, that's definitely something I want to talk about. This is more of a COVID podcast today, but I definitely want to do a separate podcast with you later in the summer once some of those ideas and action steps are flushed out about those new social justice initiatives and action plans that you're establishing. Because, like you said, it is at the forefront, and it is, it's something that we're going to have to implement, and rightfully so.
With you.
When it comes to, the FCS and FBS levels, how much are you following what the NFL will do and some of these other professional leagues that are going to be coming back in July and August to see how they're handling COVID?
I'm paying attention more as a fan than as a professional, because we can't replicate what they're doing. They can afford to test daily. They can afford to enforce, bubbles. They can throw a lot of money at this problem that we can't. They can throw a lot of restrictions at this problem, which we can't just by nature of college sports. So, yes, I follow. Yes, I'm sure there are going to be lessons to be learned, but I'm not sure how applicable those lessons are going to be. I just hope that they're successful, because if they fail with all of the resources and ability to restrict that they have, then it's going to be that much more challenging for us to operate this fall.
You talked about the cost involved with some of these tests as a whole. What kind of financial burden does COVID present for the league, for member institutions, and for individual athletic departments?
To say that our institutions are under financial pressures understates it to the point of the extreme. Until we know what our enrollments look like this fall, and that applies to all of our schools, public and private, Missouri Valley football. We don't know the extremity, the extreme that we're going to be looking at, but everyone is searching for every possible way to cost cut and to manage, our athletic departments without dropping sports. And that's a real challenge. And, if you follow the news, there's not a day that goes by now that you don't read about somebody dropping a sport or canceling a tournament or putting restrictions on non-conference competition. There's just a lot of financial pressure that, to be honest, our schools have always had financial pressures. And then you add, the prospect of lost revenues and increased costs, and it's hard to find silver linings. But I'll give you one. If there are no fans in the stand, we're not in the same shape that FBS is. We're not reliant on multi-million-dollar paydays, 7, 8, 9 weekends in the fall to run our entire athletic programs. That's not our model. And so I take some comfort in that knowing that even if we have an interrupted season, or God forbid, no season, sports isn't what's going to make or break our universities right now. It's enrollment.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I was talking with Mike Kern about it, and given that the TV rating, given that we have this great system of ESPN Plus and ESPN3, the TV rating should be through the roof, which means there should be more opportunities to bring on more advertisers and generate more revenue in that form.
I love your silver lining thinking, Kelly. We're in the same boat.
There are some people out there, it's probably in the minority, that would suggest we should just table college football until next spring. And for those people that are in that select group, what would you want them to know?
I would say that any plan right now has a certain element of rolling the dice. So let's roll the dice with what we know, rather than foregoing an opportunity to play sports this fall. And, I'm mixing my metaphors here, but, throwing all your eggs in that basket. But it's Easter. We'd be playing football at Easter, which is kind of crazy. So, no, I'm of a mind that until the virus tells us no, our game plan is to stick with what we know.
Mm-hmm. What are the circumstances that would shut down next season?
That was actually a question that was asked pretty directly in our commissioners' seminars this week. And we don't know. This is one time when I think I feel really comfortable, looking you in the eye as best I can through Zoom and saying, I don't know. We don't know.
That makes sense. Well, I want to leave on a positive note. So what gives you the greatest hope right now about college football and that we will play?
Because I think we are motivated to play this sport and all sports in much the same way that we wanted to get back to sports after 9/11. And that might be kind of a crazy analogy, but we kind of need sports. We're social animals. And even if we can't be tailgating or in the stands, I think we need sports to bring us together, because historically they've served that purpose, and they've served that purpose well. So I'm hopeful that we will be motivated enough and successful enough, and have testing that's cheap enough to let us play football this fall.
Well, it's great to see you as always. I get so excited now for anything Zoom related with sports related, because I think if anything, this pandemic has reaffirmed to all of us how much we are lucky to do what we do in the world of sports, and how much we miss it.
We do. And every day I hope that I can do more than sit in my sunroom and think about football, but actually watch football this fall.
Well, thank you for taking the time today, and happy birthday to Frank.
Thanks, Kelly.